Sometimes the people we trust to protect us are the ones who leave the deepest scars. Returning home for summer break turned out to be an unexpectedly perplexing and emotionally tangled journey, one that I never anticipated. At the age of 20, having just emerged from the rigors of finals, I found myself eagerly anticipating a few blissful months filled with the warmth of home-cooked meals and the luxury of uninterrupted sleep. My parents resided in a tranquil suburb with identical houses and meticulously manicured lawns, the sort of locale where life unfolds in a predictable rhythm. Yet this time circumstances had shifted. The house no longer carried the same essence. Perhaps I did not. My father was laboring harder than he ever had before. He has consistently maintained a certain distance, neither abusive nor cruel, merely absent. I would sit in the living room, absorbed in the flickering screen, when the front door would creak open. He would step inside, briefcase in hand, his suit immaculate, his gaze sweeping over me as if I were invisible. He hardly spoke to Mom either. They coexisted in proximity, yet remained apart. One becomes acutely aware of such details after a time spent apart. My mother, conversely, was behaving oddly. Not in any discernible manner. She continued to prepare breakfast, still inquiring about my day. Yet, there was an unmistakable depth in her voice. Tofu, diminished, as if she were probing for something within me that she had ceased to anticipate from him. She possessed a beauty that was undeniable. I had never considered it before, yet it has come to my attention now. The manner in which her hair cascaded in soft curls at her collarbone. Her scent was a delicate blend of lavender and a hint of sweetness. She started dressing more casually at home as summer approached, something I hadn't noticed before. I endeavored to push it from my thoughts, yet my mind clung to it far longer than I would have preferred. It was in the bathroom that the first moment of hesitation struck me. On a Wednesday, the world unfolded in its usual rhythm. Fresh from the shower, I stood wrapped in a towel, diligently brushing my teeth. She entered unannounced. Her gaze brushed against me for the briefest moment, swift enough to be unmistakably felt, and then she smiled. "Oh, my apologies," she remarked, her expression betraying no hint of remorse. "I didn't expect to find you still here." I reassured her that everything was all right. I swiftly glanced back at the mirror, feigning nonchalance as I became acutely aware of her proximity just behind me. She approached the sink adjacent to mine, leaned in, and began to remove her makeup. Her robe slightly slipped, and I quickly averted my eyes, unsure how to react in that moment. I had just completed my brushing routine and had now departed. My heart raced inexplicably. From that point onward, it established a recurring motif. Occasionally, but sufficiently to make an impression, she would enter the bathroom while I was in the midst of shaving or showering. Every time she offered an excuse, reaching for her face cream, claiming the mirror needed cleaning, I could sense her presence, a palpable static in the air. As she entered while I was only partially dressed, she remarked, "You've grown so much. It's strange seeing you like this." I chuckled at the time, yet her words lingered uncomfortably in my mind. It was an evening when we began to share the experience of watching television side by side. Father was often absent. He would often find himself working late into the night or attending dinners with clients. His phone flickered to life, revealing a message from an unfamiliar woman. I chose not to confront him, remained silent. Yet, perhaps she was aware. Perhaps that explains why she sat next to me and leaned slightly as we watched TV, closer than I was used to. One evening, we indulged in wine. She filled a glass for me and remarked, "You're of age now, aren't you?" Our conversation flowed for hours. She recounted tales from her college days that were entirely new to me, revealing the wildness of her youth and how she relinquished it all upon marrying my father. Her voice wavered slightly as she murmured, "Sometimes I wonder who I might have become if I hadn't settled so soon." A heavy silence followed. Words eluded me. She extended her hand, delicately sweeping away an invisible speck from my cheek, and offered a warm smile. A subtle disturbance stirred within me, an unsettling whisper of discontent. Yet I did not intervene. On a particular morning, I found myself once more engaged in the ritual of brushing my teeth. She walked in wearing one of Dad's oversized shirts, clearly just having woken up. I averted my gaze in an instant.
She observed.
"You really don't need to be so tense," she remarked, a gentle laugh escaping her lips. I muttered a few words under my breath and rinsed my mouth clean. She lingered beside me at the sink, her arm grazing mine, refusing to pull away. Her gaze met mine in the reflection. I resisted the urge to glance over, yet I could sense her gaze upon me. Once she departed, I found myself perched on the rim of the tub, towels clinging to my waist, my gaze fixed on the wall before me. My skin radiated warmth. My mind was in a whirl. Though no events had transpired, an undeniable shift had taken place. The boundaries of maternal care began to fade, leaving me uncertain of how to halt the shift, or if I truly desired to do so. What struck me most was the stark contrast between the facade of normalcy and the chaos lurking beneath. She continued to prepare eggs in the morning, still gently nudging me to collect my laundry. Yet, each word she uttered felt heavy with meaning. Each gaze lingered far too long. And the bathroom, the most ordinary part of our home, had begun to resemble a stage for something I wasn't prepared to define. I started to distance myself from her. She ventured out more frequently, indulging in lengthy strolls and frequenting the gym merely to pass the hours, yet she was aware of it all. On a quiet afternoon, she intercepted me at the threshold. "Is everything all right?" she inquired. "You've been acting distant," I remarked. I insisted I was fine, merely fatigued. She placed a hand on my face in a comforting way, but it lingered longer than expected. "I miss our conversations," she whispered softly. "In this house, you are the sole presence that truly acknowledges my existence." Words eluded me. My breath was momentarily suspended. Her hand hovered, suspended in time for a moment that stretched just a heartbeat too long. Then she smiled once more, as if nothing had transpired, and strolled away. That night, slumber eluded me. I found myself revisiting each moment, each word, each unintentional touch of skin. Clear lines had vanished entirely. An instinct that something was on the horizon. It was an unspoken truth, a moment sealed in time, forever beyond our grasp to reclaim. I remembered how she once smiled in old photos, carefree, radiant. That woman no longer existed. Following that night, the course of events shifted dramatically. They crept up slowly, softly, with such caution that if I were to share it with anyone, it would seem as though I were embellishing the truth. Yet, I found myself not in that place. It was in the manner she began to seek out excuses to draw closer to me. A hand rested on my knee as we sat together on the couch, her fingers weaving through my hair, her voice soft as she remarked on how grown up I appeared. Hugs that lingered, yet felt different than before. One morning, I awoke to discover breakfast already laid out on the table. Fluffy pancakes, crispy bacon, perfectly cooked eggs, and a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice. She sat there, a smile gracing her lips, clad in a tank top and shorts that left little to the imagination. I inquired whether it was a moment of significance. She remarked, You're my occasion." I chuckled nervously, uncertain of how to interpret her words. Her gaze lingered on me as I consumed every bite, each morsel. That very week, she began entering my room unannounced. As the moment arrived to tackle the folded laundry, she inquired if I could assist her in repairing her laptop. Every time she positioned herself just behind me, her breath brushing softly against my neck. I remained silent, yet my heart was a tempest of emotions. My heart raced at the mere sight of her. I despised the extent of my awareness. She spoke of my father often, yet her words carried an unsettling weight. She confided that he hadn't laid a finger on her in nearly a year, that he scarcely acknowledged her presence, and that there were moments when she longed for a different choice in marriage. Then she would gaze at me with an intensity that felt devoid of maternal warmth, more akin to scrutiny, as if she were assessing whether I could transform into that other person. As I strolled by her room one night, the gentle sound of weeping reached my ears. Pause, a gentle knock echoed. She beckoned me to enter. She perched on the edge of the bed, clad in her robe, her eyes tinged with red. I inquired about her well-being. She remained silent, merely gazing upward as she extended her arms wide. After a moment of doubt, I took a seat next to her. I wish I had told her to leave. I wish I had locked the door. But I didn't. She leaned closer, enveloping me in her embrace, and murmured, "I just don't want to feel alone anymore." Our arms touched in the dim light, the closeness bringing more confusion than comfort. I remained still. I lacked the confidence to do so. Her hand moved gently on my arm, a gesture meant to soothe, but it unsettled me deeply. She drew back just enough to meet my gaze. Her gaze met mine, a fiery red and glistening, yet filled with an undeniable intensity. "You've changed a lot since you were younger," she said with a strange softness in her voice. I remained silent. She leaned in, her face inches from mine, as if waiting for a response I didn't know how to give. Then she withdrew, a smile gracing her lips as if the moment before had never occurred. "I should sleep," she remarked. I nodded and departed. In that moment, she ceased her pretense. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we found ourselves at the sink, washing dishes side by side, when suddenly, a glass slipped from her grasp and shattered on the floor. It splintered at my feet, and she swiftly knelt to tidy up the fragments. I knelt to assist her, and as she clasped my hand, her gaze locked onto mine. She spoke softly, "You're always here when I need you." Her face hovered near mine, allowing me to discern the delicate lines that framed her eyes. The subtle parting of her lips, just a whisper of an opening. Nothing transpired, yet everything unfolded. Once more, I found myself steering clear of her, and she was quick to pick up on it. She labeled me as cold and distant, questioning whether I found her disgusting. I replied, "No, of course not." Yet, deep down, I knew I was deceiving both myself and her. Uncertainty clouded my thoughts, leaving me in a state of confusion. This was far from a mere innocent flirtation. It was intentional. The most terrifying aspect was that I had not uttered the words to make her cease. One afternoon, she entered the bathroom as I was in the midst of shaving. She lingered at the threshold, her voice soft yet reassuring. "Don't worry. I won't peek." Yet, she made no move to depart. She entered the room, positioned herself behind me, and observed my reflection in the glass. I endeavored to maintain my gaze ahead, yet her presence was palpable. The atmosphere was heavy. Her fingertips grazed my back with a delicate touch. "You've overlooked a spot," she remarked. She extended her hand, tracing her finger along my jawline. My hands quivered ever so slightly as I washed the razor clean. I assured her that I was all right, that I could manage on my own, yet she remained still. "I enjoy seeing you like this," she said, so calm, so confident. I chose not to reply. Was unable to. She finally stepped back and said, "I'll let you finish." Her voice lingered, a playful tease in the air. My mind was in a whirl. Throughout the night, I found myself wide awake for what felt like an eternity. I was engulfed in a wave of shame, a simmering anger directed primarily at myself for my inaction, failing to confront her, to stand my ground, to leave and reveal everything to my dad. Yet I refrained. I held it all within, a secret I was reluctant to unveil, for a fragment of my being feared the conclusion of it all. We began to indulge in wine with greater frequency. The ritual of late-night conversations settled into a comforting cadence. The dialogue took on a deeper emotional resonance, becoming increasingly intimate. She spoke of her regrets, of how she had never truly felt acknowledged by anyone except for me. I devoured it eagerly. I longed to be essential, to be the preferred choice, even if that desire was directed towards the one individual from whom I ought to refrain. She began to refer to me as her guardian. She expressed that she felt most secure in my presence. Once, she playfully remarked, "You remind me of someone I used to know. Someone stronger." I found myself at a loss for words. I took a slow sip of my drink, my gaze drifting elsewhere. The proximity lingered. Her fingers would brush against my knee as she wove her tales. Her hand would hesitate, lingering just a moment longer as she passed me something. Once she adjusted my collar, her hand lingered on my chest for a moment that felt like an eternity. Every time I reassured myself of its innocence, I knew deep down it was anything but. Both of us were aware of that truth. My thoughts were in disarray. My concentration eluded me. Rest eluded me. As I gazed at her from across the dinner table, memories of her hand resting gently on my back flooded my mind. Her gaze met mine, as if I were the sole individual of significance in her world. I found myself submerged in a predicament from which I could see no way out. And the most troubling aspect was my uncertainty about whether I truly desired to. Awakened by the sound of shouting from below. For once, my dad was home, and the air was thick with tension as they argued. Though I may not have caught every word, the tone conveyed it all. He leveled an accusation at her, likely regarding infidelity. She charged him with a perpetual absence, an unwavering indifference. Then came the silence, thick and suffocating. I remained in my room until the conclusion arrived. When I finally descended, he had vanished. She sat at the kitchen table, her eyes swollen and heavy, hardly making a dent in her coffee. She remained silent. I didn't either. On that fateful night, she rapped gently on my door. Her voice carried a gentle softness. I inquired whether all was well. She expressed her desire to avoid solitude. I invited her to enter. She perched delicately on the edge of my bed. Her robe hung loosely, hair still damp, and her face was freshly washed. She appeared unvarnished, as if she had stripped away every facade. She remained silent for a time. Then she uttered, "I believe it's over." I inquired, "You and Dad?" She gave a slight nod. "He has been involved with another for months." I was aware of it. I simply didn't want to confront the truth. I yearned to offer her solace. I truly did. Yet, the gaze she cast upon me blurred the lines of emotion. She didn't appear as a mother grieving a lost union. Rather, she resembled a woman poised, yearning for an invitation. I assured her that such treachery was unmerited. She edged nearer. "You always know what to say," she murmured. "You make me feel acknowledged." She placed a hand on my knee as if trying to connect, and I froze, uncertain how to respond. Frozen in place, she confessed. I shouldn't feel this way. Yet, the truth lingered in the air between us. I longed to voice my thoughts, but silence enveloped me. My mind urged me to intervene, to rise and escape the moment, yet my body remained anchored. She leaned closer, her face inches from mine, as if waiting for a response I didn't know how to give. "Tell me to stop," she said, her voice quivering. I shouldn't have, but I didn't. The events that followed lacked any sense of drama or fervor. The atmosphere was heavy with a languid stillness, an unsettling silence that wrapped around everything like a shroud, evoking a sense of dread. The silence between us became unbearable, each moment weighed down by things left unsaid. I failed to consider the implications. I found myself responding, and when it came to an end, silence enveloped us. She rested her head on me quietly, the closeness bringing more confusion than comfort. I gazed at the ceiling, my heart racing, a wave of shame surging within me. At last, she rose, adjusted her robe, and declared, "This changes everything." I remained silent, was unable to. She departed from my room, and I remained seated, feeling as though I had just stepped outside the confines of my own existence. The following morning, she maintained an air of normalcy, as if nothing had transpired, brewed coffee, and inquired about my breakfast preferences. I found myself unable to meet her gaze. The sound of her voice made my stomach churn. Not due to any hatred I felt towards her, for I did not harbor such feelings. That was the issue at hand. I despised the way everything had unfolded and the weight it placed on my conscience. I devoted the day to the great outdoors, strolled through the neighborhood, wandered without purpose, attempted to erase from memory. Yet the memory continued to echo endlessly. Her visage, her tone, her complexion. Each moment unfolds in the darkness behind my closed eyes. Upon my return, she was engrossed in her usual television viewing. Her gaze met mine, a silent inquiry in her eyes. I pressed on without hesitation. I made my way directly to my room. As the night deepened, she rapped on the door once more. I chose not to respond. She grasped the handle and gave it a turn. "I simply wish to converse," she remarked. I remained quiet. After a brief pause, she turned and walked away. I heard the soft click of her door shutting. I felt unwell. In the days that followed, a serene stillness enveloped the atmosphere, excessively silent. Our words were few and far between. She refrained from knocking once more. I evaded her at every opportunity that presented itself. Yet, the atmosphere surrounding us was heavy with unspoken words. She began to send messages, brief and concise. "Is everything all right with you? May we engage in a conversation?" I turned a blind eye to them. Then one night, she sent a message that read, "I'm sorry if I crossed a line." That broke me. I crafted a response, only to erase it, then started anew. She responded, "You didn't stop me, but you also didn't ask for it either." I remained silent. What could I possibly say? I ceased sharing meals with her, departed the house at dawn, returned after dark, yet I remained, still beneath the same roof, still passing her room each night with my heart pounding in my chest. I thought about confiding in someone, perhaps a friend or a therapist. But how does one articulate such a thing without casting oneself as the antagonist? One evening, I found her weeping once more. I lingered silently behind my door. This time, she didn't seek me out. She wept in solitude, and in that isolation, the pain deepened. She attempted to mend the rift, leaving behind notes filled with small apologies, bringing my favorite treats. One evening, she even suggested, "Let's act as if none of this ever occurred." We could return to the way things once were, yet we found ourselves unable to do so. Retracing one's steps was no longer an option. Not after what transpired between us.
I began to formulate my departure.
I concocted a story about a summer internship. She didn't contest it, merely nodded in agreement. "Perhaps that's for the best," she murmured. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, yet none fell. On my final evening, she appeared at my door once more. This time, I chose to open it. She appeared weary, fractured. "I just wanted to bid farewell properly," she confessed. I nodded in understanding. I embraced her. Then she released her grip and turned away. The next morning, I hurriedly packed my things, words escaping me. She lingered at the door as I loaded the car. "Be safe," she said. I nodded in response. That was all. As I drove off, I glanced in the rearview mirror. She remained there, silent, simply observing. And I was flooded with emotions once more. Regret, confusion, shame, longing. I continued to drive, the road stretching endlessly before me. Time slipped away, yet the memory remained vivid and unyielding. Even as I distanced myself, the heaviness lingered, an unwelcome companion. I immersed myself in work, embraced the night, and sought solace in distractions. I spoke of needing space, space from home, from my parents' divorce, from the ever-present tension. No one probed deeper, but the truth trailed behind me like a shadow. Flashes of her would appear in the faces of strangers, her voice lingering in the silence around me. There were mornings when I'd awaken, sensing her presence beside me, only to confront the painful truth that it was merely a haunting echo of a memory I should have let go. I resented the way she filled my mind, not merely a chapter of my past, but a mark etched into every aspect of my life. I chose not to call. I refrained from sending a message, yet she reached out. It began with brief updates. "I hope you're managing well. The house seems desolate in your absence." Then came a photo of the dog curled up on my bed. I chose not to reply. Her messages dwindled, but soon her silence resonated more profoundly than any words could convey. One evening, she texted, "Do you ever reflect on that night?" I gazed at it for hours on end. I remained silent. The temptation to fabricate a story lingered, yet I knew it wouldn't alter reality. It occupied my thoughts incessantly. A few weeks passed and then her call came. I chose not to answer. A voicemail followed, her tone unnervingly serene. "I'm not attempting to draw you back. I merely need to know that you're all right." I erased it, yet the echo of her voice lingered far beyond my desire. The guilt did not diminish. It transformed. I began to hold myself accountable for not putting an end to it sooner, for allowing it to escalate to such lengths. In my attempts to rationalize my inaction, the only explanation I could muster was one of cowardice. I permitted it to unfold. I allowed it to spiral out of control. And worse still, there were moments when I wished it would never end. Months slipped by before our paths crossed again. It was unexpected. I returned home for a family gathering, convinced she wouldn't be there. Yet, there she stood in the kitchen, as if time had stood still. Our eyes locked. No words were exchanged. She offered a polite smile. I gave a nod. That was all there was. We moved through the space as if we were mere acquaintances. Despite being in close proximity, she posed simple inquiries, and I responded with terse replies. To the outside world, we appeared to be nothing more than a mother and her child. Only we were aware of the deeper reality concealed beneath our superficial exchanges and forced grins. Eventually, we found ourselves in a moment of solitude. She inquired, "Are you happy?" I remarked, "I was making an effort." She acknowledged with a nod. That sentiment is rare among many. I inquired about her well-being. Her gaze fell.
"I'm surviving."
Then came the stillness. We exchanged no further words for the remainder of the visit. Afterward, she ceased her attempts to connect. I thought she had come to terms with the end, that we had both opted for separation rather than turmoil. I was mistaken. A year later, a message arrived. "I miss you." I was left in the dark about her intentions. Did she long for me as her son, or was it the memories we shared that she missed? I chose silence, opting not to inquire or respond. Instead, I severed the connection by blocking her number, believing that would conclude our chapter. Yet that was not the case. She found alternative routes to reach me. I erased her presence from social media, but her messages became increasingly urgent. "You don't have to shut me out," they pleaded. "We both desired it, didn't we? I just need reassurance that you don't harbor any animosity towards me." That last remark struck a chord because I felt none. I wished I could, but it was impossible. I loathed the circumstances. I detested the recollection, yet I could never bring myself to hate her, and that only intensified my turmoil. I contemplated seeking therapy, yet whenever I attempted to articulate the narrative swirling in my mind, it always seemed too far-fetched. I hesitated to voice my thoughts, fearing that doing so would render them unchangeable, set in stone. Thus I chose silence. I told myself that keeping my distance was the answer. If I never returned, if I never engaged, perhaps it would all gradually dissipate. Yet trauma operates differently. It transforms. As I ventured into new relationships, I found myself retreating whenever intimacy loomed. My own instincts had become untrustworthy. I found myself grappling with the limits of my own existence. I pondered the notion of being irreparably flawed. Time slipped by, and I constructed a facade of normalcy, an admirable job, a secure apartment, a circle of friends. Yet, the complete truth remained unspoken. I had alluded to the tension in my relationship with my mother, but the reasons behind it remained shrouded in silence. That fragment of my soul remained imprisoned. Then, unexpectedly, a handwritten letter arrived. No return address, yet I recognized the sender immediately. For a moment, I hesitated to open it. Curiosity won out. The note was brief, just a handful of lines. "I'm sorry for everything. I know what I did was wrong. I don't expect forgiveness. I just hope you live a life without shadows. That's all I ever wanted for you." I burned the letter, not in anger, but because I didn't want to hold on to it. I had no desire for a reminder of what I already bore daily. That chapter had been closed, yet its impact lingered. Now, when inquiries about my past arise, I select my words with precision. I do not fabricate, but I also refrain from revealing everything. Certain truths are burdensome, too weighty for casual disclosure. Occasionally, she visits my dreams. Not as she once did, no longer in longing, in bewilderment, in remorse, or in sorrow. I envision the version of her that ought to have shielded me rather than employing me as a means to flee her own suffering. And while I have progressed in the hushed recesses of my thoughts, the scar remains. Not out of a desire to recall, but because to forget would be akin to allowing it to transpire once more. Some scars never fade. They just learn to live quietly beneath your skin. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe to Tales of Euphoria for more haunting, unforgettable stories that stay with you long after they end.